The ability to utilize the information we gain is, in its most basic form, the element which allows us to function, employ critical thinking, and rationalize our everyday circumstances. To learn, many of us study the content of textbooks, acquiring fundamentals to provide a foundation of theoretical knowledge and understanding in subjects we strive to become masterful in. It is invariably true that without the practical application of this knowledge, it remains merely an idealistic mastery, never suffering the rigours of real-world pressure testing. Previously, we provided you our version of a textbook understanding of mental health and the legal system. Up until now, however, we haven't applied and road-tested its practical application. That's about to change as we test your compassion, empathy, understanding, humanity, and objectivity by adding a primary element to the melting pot of your learning: the victims of crimes. Last episode, we asked you to come ready with an empty canvas and a palette full of mental colours. So prepare yourself for class, as school is in session here on the next episode of Just Lawful.
Adelaide is the perfect place to set a horror story. You know why all those films and books are always set in sleepy conservative towns? Because sleepy conservative towns are where those things happen. Exorcism, omens, shining, poltergeists. Adelaide is Amityville or Salem, and things here go bump in the night.
Welcome again to Just Lawful, where things do indeed go bump in the night. My name is Daniel Panozzo, and as always, I'm once again joined by my co-host, Sean Fuster.
You don't look like any teacher I have ever had, but if you say class is in session, Daniel, then class is in session.
I'll have you at the front of the class, Mr. Fuster. I don't like the look on your face already.
Oh, that sounds familiar. Now you do sound like every teacher I've ever had.
Absolutely. There'll be detention at recess. We'll discuss this later. Before we begin, as always, a huge thank you to everyone listening. If you haven't heard our previous episodes, and indeed the first episode in this next series, we would absolutely love and recommend and greatly appreciate you going straight over to iTunes or Spotify, subscribe, rate, leave us a 5-star review, whatever you can do there to help get our work out to those people who need to hear it most or would like to hear this kind of thing. Our journey so far, Sean, we went back and we get, as I said, a textbook understanding of what we believe, the concept of mental health and the legal system look like. We went over, as you put it last episode, a quite academic approach toward this.
Yeah, a bloodless one that, as you said in the opening, hasn't been pressure tested. This is the literal reading of the law, not the application to real-world circumstances.
Beyond that, what we also did was we had a little bit of a peek behind the curtain, if you like, and understood the first time you were introduced to this, and a young Sean Fuster, very, very raw in the world of court reporting at the time, got, as I called it then, a baptism of fire, really, of how mental health issues are looked at from a legal perspective, and certainly had an understanding or an outcome or just a whole process that you certainly didn't see coming on understand.
And much like all the listeners right now, I went straight from that coalface understanding of the moment through to sitting down, reading the legislation, learning about it, and my understanding has evolved over the 20 years since and over the cases that we're going to look at as the rest of this series rolls on, because knowledge shouldn't stay stagnant. The problem is sometimes the law stays stagnant.
Yeah, look, that evolution piece and that continual learning piece is very crucial to this. And as you said, we did have an academic look at it, and we actually broke down, section 269 last time, and we read through that, and we read, Mr. Kimber's description of that, which you were quite a lot of praise involved in that process as well. In saying that, it's the element that you mentioned that we haven't touched on there really is that concept of adding the victim piece around this. And that's where, in the last episode, I talked about, the understanding, the emotions that come with that. As a victim, or the family of a victim, or a friend of a victim in that sense, depending on where you stand within this situation, you generally tend to have a very different perspective and therefore a very different understanding, and also a lot of different emotional ideas that come along with that. And that certainly, I won't say clouds it, it makes it a very unclear circumstance. And certainly people get very emotive about how they look at the process. And I want you to recap that process we talked about in 269 before of how do we use 269 in the idea of when we look at what is or isn't, depending on how it comes. A criminal act has occurred, we know that, but how do we use 269 when we want to look at is someone legally responsible for that situation?
So the first thing we do is look at someone's mental competence to commit the act. Were they or were they not mentally competent? If they were mentally competent, if they understood that what they were doing was a crime or had the ability to rationalize out that what they did may have criminal consequences, they were mentally competent, they go back to the usual criminal jurisdiction.
Mm-hmm.
If they are mentally incompetent due to a disability or due to a mental illness, whether it had been diagnosed previously or not, they are found mentally incompetent and therefore not guilty of the crime by reason of mental incompetence.
Yeah.
The next thing the court does, though, is look at the actual act itself, the car crash, the stabbing, the bombing, whatever it may be, and determine whether or not that set of circumstances would have been in the ordinary course a crime.
Yeah.
That's done to set the limiting term, the period that a person will spend in mental health detention, be that within a facility or simply living in the community and being very closely monitored. That period of time is set by a weighing up of the seriousness of the act that was committed. So it ping-pongs back and forth. We start with, are you or are you not mentally incompetent? Was it or was it not a crime? If it was a crime, does that mean that the sentence should be this long? Well, that sentence gets turned into a period in care, which is then tacked back onto the fact that you were mentally incompetent in the first place.
As you said, it does ping-pong around, and it certainly is worthwhile, I guess, trying to give an overview of how that works, because that was something that I had to get my head around even as we were going through the process in the last episode.
And we know from some of the feedback too that people out there have listened a couple of times to the past episode to actually, make sure that they really get this. And we really appreciate you all doing that, because think about Junior Burger Sean way back in 2002 with that very first case I ever encountered. I was caught off guard by it. I didn't understand it. I had to go do my reading. But I didn't have an emotional stake in what was going on.
Absolutely.
Imagine being someone who has lost a loved one or suffered any kind of loss or injury as a result of an action by someone who was mentally incompetent. How are you going to pass out that very complicated little bit of legalistic limbo that we just did and come to accept it, I guess, to be in a place where you can say, all right, I acknowledge that that person isn't a criminal, but what was done to me is a crime, but they will not go to jail for it. Instead, they will be rehabbed for it.
Well, it's funny you say that, because the very, first case we did look at, which was your introduction, was, I guess, a very unique take on that in itself, in regard to what had occurred. A victim in this case had a crime perpetrated on them by their husband, who then was found, had a mental incapacity at the time, a break with reality at that point, therefore wasn't responsible necessarily for that. However,
therefore it wasn't a crime.
Therefore a crime hadn't occurred, yet this action had occurred to this person, but this person then also didn't want them to go to jail, wanted them to come home. Therefore, when we look at that, they were found not guilty by reason of mental incapacity. Is that the right term?
Incompetence. Not guilty by reason of mental incompetence.
That's the wording, absolutely. And so at the end of that situation, that victim didn't look at that from a case of they weren't, from a crime. It was a loved one who had had an episode, and therefore this had resulted from that, and they still went home and had a life together after the fact.
That's right, and to my knowledge, to this day, still do.
In this episode, though, what it's fair to say, Sean, is we're going to add some more examples or some case studies of cases you have covered, and we're going to really start to look at how, as I said, depending on where you come from, where you sit within this case, there's a lot of different ways to view this, either a victim or a support person, and we want to start to have a look at adding that element we talked about of victims to this as well.
Yeah, because some of these people have reacted in ways similar to what I discussed in our last episode. Others have reacted with anger, with disbelief. Some have had their views heard by the court. Others have been completely silenced by the court.
Yeah.
In some of these cases, the person who suffered the mental illness is someone known to the victims.
Sure.
In other cases, it's a complete stranger. It really does sort of span the gamut
Yeah.
of what these kind of cases can be, which is not only why we've selected them, but also I want to talk about ones that have informed my understanding as time's gone on.
And I hope one thing that people see, we keep going back to that analogy of bring your canvas to this, bring a really wide array of mental color palette that you want to paint your picture with, because you've just highlighted there, and the cases that we are going to look at bring so many different varied elements and ideas and perspectives with them, sitting on top of a situation that we already had to unpack and try to readdress of when we use something like a 269, how is this looked at in the first place in a complex situation where we're adding equally, if not more complex ideas in these cases on top of that yet again.
Yeah, it's one thing to have an absolute bird's nest of legality to pick your way through, let alone a game of Jenga or Kerplunk of family relationships.
Absolutely. So this is the, some of the extra levels of complexity. This is going to be a really interesting deep dive. We've got some cases that I'm sure people are going to be familiar with when we talk about the names. Talk to me, Sean, about the first one. Where do we want to start?
We're going to start this analysis with the case of Vicky Lee Wagner. Vicky Lee Wagner was moving into a brand new home. She had some help from some family members. One family member came inside the house to help her. Another went back to the car to move some furniture. When he got back to the front door, he found his wife, Vicky's mother, absolutely mutilated on the front step, having been stabbed 146 times. It's May 2010. Kimber Court in Salisbury, a northern suburb of Adelaide.
Yep.
Vicky Wagner's moving into a new house.
Mm-hmm.
Her mum, Joyce Brown, is helping her. Joyce's husband, Andrew, is also helping them.
Sure.
Vicky and Joyce go inside. He goes back to the car, gets another piece of furniture. When he comes back, he finds Joyce dead. And like I said, Joyce had been stabbed 146 times just in the time it took to walk from the front door to the car, grab a piece of furniture, turn around and come back. Less than 5 minutes.
Yeah.
I want to put this in perspective for you. 146 stab wounds is more wounds than all of the stab wounds inflicted combined on the 3 victims of the Kapunda triple murder. Now, we all know that case. We all know how infamous that matter is. This is more stab wounds on a single person in not even half the time, a fraction of the time.
I also just want to highlight there, and not that I want to glorify this crime in any way, shape, or form.
Well, it's not a crime.
No, okay.
This incident.
This incident. Good call.
I'm going to keep picking you up on that because we have to. We have to. This incident.
One thing I want people to understand about that is the physical nature of that situation. And what I mean by that is we hear the number 146 times of stab wounds, right? People probably don't have a perception or a concept of how physically demanding that is to do. Like if you want to go through that practice, just imagine yourself stabbing and just literally throw your arm back and forth 146 times. See how long firstly that takes you to do that. See how much physical energy and fatigue you get from doing that. Now also try to understand the concept that you are pushing that into a surface or a body of something. You then have the friction and also the resistance of having to pull it back out to do that. The physical exertion it takes to do 146 stab wounds, and then on top of the fact that it was mere minutes, the short amount of time you're talking about, that is a frenzied, very physical attack. To do that, that's not generally something that someone in a normal state would be able to physically do beyond the ethical and moral aspects of this as well. I just want people to really understand how in-depth and I guess intense that situation is.
And the entire situation would continue to be intense. I came into the matter on July 8th, 2011. It's the first time I covered the case. And that was the day that Vicky Wagner was found not guilty by reason of mental incompetence.
Right.
And sentenced to a limiting term of life. Now, why did she get life?
Yeah.
Here we go. Here's your pop quiz, Hotshot. Why did she get life?
Okay, so although if it's the mental angle on that, so we take away the criminal piece. However, if this was a criminal act,
what crime would it have been?
it would have been murder.
Yep.
Okay, so if we have a look at murder, we know that any murder in this state gets, a foundation of 20 years.
A minimum of
minimum
20
years. Yep.
But a life
But a
sentence.
life sentence, minimum 20 life sentence for any of that. Therefore, we have to then apply that same time frame to the concept of the limited term applied to this.
That's right. So if you commit a murder or if you kill somebody while mentally incompetent, you are not guilty of murder, but you are sentenced to a limiting term of life.
Right.
So for the rest of her life, Vicky Wagner will be under mental health supervision.
Yeah.
Justice Margaret Nyland said, "My concern is to get her to James Nash House, that is the secure facility here in South Australia, as soon as possible so she can have some supervision."
Okay.
Justice Nyland wanted her to be looked after very quickly. Her lawyers were saying she suffered a break with reality. She was not able to reason with a moderate degree of composure about the wrongfulness of her actions.
Yeah, right.
She was so severely psychotic, so markedly psychotic, that her reason was disrupted.
Okay.
There's that piece we talked about last episode. Could not fathom the fact that what she was doing in that moment would have been considered a crime because her reason was disrupted by her marked psychosis.
Okay.
That's a horrible thing to hear, that a mother and a daughter have been involved in this situation.
Absolutely.
There's a third person,
Okay.
and that's Michelle Chamberlain. Michelle is Vicky's sister
Right.
and Joyce's other daughter,
Okay.
and she's sitting in court watching this happen,
Mm.
watching a court commit her sister to a life of mental health care
Yeah.
for the death of her mother.
Yeah.
Just beyond confronting.
Mm.
And I talked to Michelle and I said to her, how are you actually managing to process all of this?
Yeah.
And all she could say to me at that time was, "This is so very sad. These are the two ladies in my life."
Yeah. Absolutely. That's one of those moments, again, where we talk about one is dead. However, we've essentially lost two people out of our lives in that instance. So
think about the Abrahimsa days again.
Correct. Exactly. That's kind of where my mind went to. So from Michelle there, I feel for her in that sense of, as she said, it's just so sad. How else do you try to begin to start to understand and process that?
I would love to tell you that that's where the sadness ended for Michelle Chamberlain and the rest of the family.
Yeah.
But this is just lawful. We know that's not the case. Otherwise, we wouldn't be talking about it. September 10, 2013. I touch base with Michelle Chamberlain and her family again because they are going through something that is going to sound sadly familiar to our listeners. It's only been 3 years at this point since Joyce died, since Vicky stabbed her 146 times. She's making application to be let out.
Wow.
Remember what I said to you, a limiting term doesn't necessarily have to be served in a secure facility.
Because that's the piece we then had to look at. Does your condition at that point then mean you need to serve it supervised, in a facility, in the community? That's when we ping pong back to where does that sit within that space?
Judge Kimber's words, limiting term protects the community.
Yes.
But how is the community best protected?
Sure.
It's not the judge that decides where you serve that limiting term.
Yeah.
That's up to the Forensic Mental Health Service, the Department for Corrections, all sorts of other service agencies get involved.
Right.
And the decision was made by psychologists and by people involved that it was time for Vicky to come back into the community.
Can I ask at that point, just quickly, because it was when we talked on the first case that we looked at in the last episode, I asked you the question, and I'm interested in this point. Was this an isolated incident or had there been a history of this? Because in the last one we talked about, it was a single case where it was a single break with reality that caused that situation. What about this case?
Well, talking to Michelle is what gave me that information.
Okay.
So Michelle rang me and she said, "Sean, we haven't spoken for a while. I need your help. They want to let Vicky out. We're terrified.
Right.
We are all frightened that something's going to happen to one of us, that one of us is going to be next." I said to her, "Michelle, that's horrible. I'm so sorry to hear it. What do you base that on?"
Yeah.
She said, "Well, we base that on what we've learned since."
Mm.
And what they'd learned since Joyce's death was that Vicky had a decade-long history of mental illness.
Oh, okay.
Nobody in the family had been told about her exact diagnosis, her treatment regime, or the fact that prior to Joyce's death she was being regularly monitored because of the state's privacy laws.
Okay.
Think about that for a minute.
Yeah.
Privacy laws have dropped a shield in front of what Vicky's going through.
Yep.
And in the ordinary course, we understand that.
Yeah.
But had Joyce been aware, maybe she wouldn't have been alone in the house at that moment. Certainly helping her daughter move house, but maybe would have taken a couple of extra steps of security or a bit of extra care because she would have known what she was dealing with.
Sure.
Joyce had no idea. It wasn't her fault at all.
Yeah.
I said to Michelle, okay, what do you need from me? She said, the prosecution won't listen to me. This is where it's going to start sounding familiar to listeners. We don't want her out.
Mm-hmm.
We want to be represented. The prosecution is saying, we haven't reached a position on that yet. We want them to hurry up and reach a position because we are terrified. This is what she said to me. I'm scared, unbelievably fearful, and freaked out. How can they even contemplate releasing someone 3 years after killing someone? Vicky killed our mother with 146 stab wounds in minutes, and she doesn't remember it anymore. But we are scarred forever by it, and we fear we could be next. I wasn't told my sister had applied for release until after there had already been a court hearing, and the DPP didn't ring me after the second hearing. Now, I wasn't aware of either of those two hearings.
Okay.
They spoke to my father and told him that their position at the moment is that they don't have a position. Well, our family has a clear position. Please, don't let her out. We're all really frightened. We've got young men in our family who are afraid she's going to turn up. She said, Vicky would walk into your house at 4 a.m. and you'd wake up to find her standing over you smiling. We knew something was going on. We knew that she must have been ill in some way. But that doesn't mean we allowed her to keep doing it, and she shouldn't be allowed to have the chance to hurt anybody else.
Yeah, that's quite chilling, Sean, and it paints a very different picture. And as I was wondering, is this an isolated incident, or had there been occurrences? Whether there'd been actual physical occurrences previously, there was certainly some signs there that something wasn't quite right.
Yeah, and the family had no concept of just how deep that goes, because they weren't allowed to know. Vicky was an adult. This isn't a case where you've got someone under the age of 18 where the GP's talking to the parent and saying you need to be involved in their mental health care. This is a fully functioning adult who's off on their own.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, not fully functioning.
Yeah.
And nobody's got an idea of the lack of function that's going on.
There's a part there that I just want to touch on for me, because as I'm thinking about that, as you're talking, I'm hearing that, I'm really intrigued because you now get a backstory that your sister had an ongoing condition, right? We get that now. I don't know if I was Michelle in that situation, how I would be feeling about that. What would this be doing to my mental state? Because I don't know now if I feel somewhat slightly, I don't want to use the term better, but I have a better understanding, and maybe that makes it easier to accept that this has occurred, because previously this kind of feels like it came out of nowhere. It was a very shocking, surprising situation that, oh my God, my mother's been murdered. But now I kind of have an understanding that there was something at play. I'm really intrigued as to what that must have done to Michelle's mental state as well.
I'd never presume to speak for Michelle or anybody in any of these cases, but from my understanding from our conversations, it made her feel worse.
Yeah, well,
not better. It's not, this is an understanding,
No.
I can now put it to bed,
Correct,
this is why mum's dead. It's, this should have been given to us beforehand. Not only did you deny us information before mum died, but now you're stopping us from saying our piece now that mum has died.
Yeah.
I mean, people don't reach out to the media in a legal setting unless they have no other option. Michelle reached out to me because she said it's the only way they're going to listen. We met at a park. The entire family was there, 15, 20 people strong, and we took a photograph of all of them standing together. Big headline, "We love our sister, but don't let her out."
Those were incredibly powerful words, Sean. We love our sister, but don't let her out. How was that, I guess, taken or viewed or accepted, or was it accepted? What was done in regard to that?
If we were a different kind of show, this is where I'd tell you to press the sound effects button that sounds like screeching brakes.
Okay.
Because all of a sudden, all of the forward momentum for letting Vicky Wagner out went to a sudden, sharp stop.
Okay.
Vicky's own counsel got up in court before Justice Trish Kelly because, of course, Supreme Court matter, always stays in the Supreme Court, and said, look, we're not actually looking for her to be released into the community.
Okay.
What we want is for her to move to a step-down facility.
A step down. What's a step down facility?
So
What's that
James
mean?
Nash House is a secure facility.
Okay.
Once upon a time, unfairly, we would have called it an asylum.
Sure.
Secure doors, can't go in, can't go out.
Okay.
An actual proper secure facility.
Sure.
Ashton House is on the same grounds,
Mm-hmm.
and that is a, for want of a better term, lower security pre-release centre.
Okay. So in the term of step down in regard to the amount of sort of, I guess, not supervision, but that level of security we're stepping down.
Think of it this way. There's physical supervision and
Yep.
there's mental supervision.
Okay.
In Ashton House, you're still getting the same level of mental supervision. They're
Right.
making sure you take your meds,
Gotcha.
that you do the right thing. But they're not bodily monitoring you
Okay.
and restraining you from going from place to place.
Okay. So there's been a change of wording,
Temperature.
temperature, if you like. We're not asking to release her straight back out into the public. We wanted to go through a step down process.
That's right. And the DPP also came to the party. It's
Okay.
amazing what a newspaper article can do. They were very, very vocal about the family's wishes, about Michelle Chamberlain's
Sure.
wishes, telling the court the family do not want this, they do not support this. We've reached a position, and our position is the same as the Chamberlains.
Okay.
We are supporting them fully.
Well, it's nice, as you say, Sean, that they reached a position finally, considering we previously didn't have a position. We've now got some, I guess, public outcry, some exposure, if you like, as you said, with a news article. And suddenly we now have a position. And who would have thought? It's the same as Michelle and the rest of the family.
Very good to see. And that slowed things down for the better part of a year as
Okay.
more psychiatrists and psychologists were consulted.
Okay.
Eventually, by March of 2014, 3 reports were ready. 3 psychologists agreed that Wagner was mentally stable for the first time in her life, was much healthier than she was prior to Joyce Brown's death,
Mm-hmm.
and had undertaken victim empathy training. They opined that she doesn't remember doing it or has a patchy memory of it, but knows that she did it.
Okay.
Her risk of endangering other people is low because any attempt to release her would be subject to monitoring, and any day release would be subject to bans on her approaching her family.
Right, okay. So there would be definitely some limitations in that sense as well.
I'm going to compare it to the criminal courts again. Think of parole conditions.
Mhm.
Parole conditions say you can't go to this particular shopping centre because your victim might be shopping there.
Right.
Same sort of concept here. It's not a parole because it's not a crime,
No,
but it does function in the same sorts of ways.
absolutely.
And they also said that Wagner was mentally stable, and though understanding of her relative's position, hopes that one day they will change their minds.
Okay. So in 2014, we have undertaken a step down.
No,
Process?
at this point, we've just got all of the reports together.
Okay, so we still haven't that. Okay.
Because Justice Trish Kelly says, look, that's great.
Mm-hmm.
Come back to me with a detailed plan.
Right.
Tell me exactly what you're going to do, step by step by step in this step-down process,
Mhm.
so that I can show this to Michelle Chamberlain and her family,
Okay.
and they can have some level of understanding. I want to point out here, not every judge does that.
Right.
Justice Trish Kelly is one of a kind,
Mm-hmm.
and she took this in a very, very different direction
Sure.
that gave a lot of comfort to Michelle Chamberlain.
Okay.
She felt like the court was listening, was caring. In fact, she said to me a year later in 2014 that she felt like, I don't think the judge would have happily gone along with this. Had public policy not been about rehabilitation, I don't think this would have happened.
Okay.
She got that sense from Justice Kelly that, look, I don't want to let her out against your wishes, but the law says that the time has come because the psychologists are agreeing.
Okay. So this is, again, another level of those complexities we talked about. Although we've gone through, as you called it, the ping-pong back and forth of putting, Section 269 over this incident, we now also have to take into consideration the ongoing situation and state of this person and/or their recuperation from a mental perspective as per ascertained and determined by experts.
Those two competing factors that Judge Kimber talked about in his quote.
Yeah.
It's about your rehabilitation, but it's also about the community's protection from you during that rehabilitation. You've now got psychologists saying the Chamberlain family don't need the level of protection that they feel they need.
Okay.
They fear Vicky.
Yeah.
They have every reason to fear her, but that's not based on the reality of what we're seeing in terms of the threat that she poses.
Again, just another level of that complex situation on top of another complex environment.
That's right. That's absolutely right. Now, we now fast forward to 2016. So again, this is taking time after time after time. Imagine being Michelle Chamberlain. You're going back to court every 6 months, every 12 months to get this dragged up again. And at this point, Vicky Wagner still hasn't actually left James Nash House.
Yeah.
Until July of 2016.
Okay.
She is now, at that point, by order of Justice David Peake, allowed to leave the facility where she was being held unescorted.
I'm sorry, what?
Unescorted. We had gotten to a stage where she had been taking little bits of day leave here and there with people monitoring her at all times.
Right.
But we walk back into the court on this day, and it's time for the unescorted leave into the community.
Okay, I'm struggling to I'm trying to grapple with this right now, because a moment ago we had spent 2 years or something around the concept of we don't know whether we should give you a step down program just yet, to now suddenly you've had a bit of leave. Now we're considering you can go off by yourself.
Because this is all based on reports. This is all back of house stuff.
And
the machinery is still moving at all
times. And I
times.
understand that. That just seems like such a vast discrepancy in where those two concepts right there.
Here's the other thing. Mental health doesn't recover on a timeline.
Yeah.
Some people recover faster.
Yeah.
Some people recover slower. Some people remain a danger and a threat.
Sure.
Other people wake up one morning and they are better, for want of a better term. I understand everybody out there. That's a very ignorant term on my part. I hope you get what I'm trying to say here.
Not still.
There's no continuum.
No. They're not still under the same concept of all the constraints that were making them act that way previously. So we know what you mean.
That's right. And look, Justice Peake said to Vicky, it's quite understandable that you have a genuine grievance, but I have to look at this in a more objective way. Back to that legislation again. He's assessed the risk, and, Michelle's saying, I'm of the view that you remain a safety issue, not only for me, but to the community in general. When I'm in court, you look through me without showing any emotion.
Okay.
That's her fear. She's basing all of that understanding on her experiences with her sister, her life with her sister, and her genuine fear that someone else in the family is going to be next.
Yep.
But, the court is trying to make decisions based on evidence. And it's got 3 of the top forensic psychologists and psychiatrists in South Australia saying that she is ready to be released, that she can be out in the community, unescorted, leave in the morning, come back at night. Still got to live within the grounds of mental health supervision, not living on her own yet, but she can go out for the day and do her shopping and come back without anybody watching her.
This is one of those moments where I'm not just asking our listeners to. I myself am having to scrub out some of those paint-by-number colorations that I had put on my canvas, because I need to extend my palette, because I, on the surface, feel a little bit uncomfortable with that. I'm not going to lie. And I can only imagine that hearing that for the first time, that's probably going to make a lot of people listening to that quite uncomfortable. I understand we've had psychologists come in and they've told us, things are different and she's not the level of danger that she once was, and we can allow. I get that. To then know that she's got 8 hours or so out in public, unsupervised, feels a little uncomfortable. And I'm not going to try and hide that. And that's, as I say, I'm challenging our listeners to do what I'm trying to do right now. I'm trying to change my color palette here, and I'm not painting by numbers. I'm really trying to understand this, and I guess try to dissipate some of that uncomfortableness.
Well, I'm going to add to your discomfort.
Okay.
Keep in mind we're in 2016 at this point.
Mm-hmm.
Joyce died 6 years prior.
Yeah.
If this was a murder, if this had been a criminal matter,
sure, there
is no way that a person would be receiving day leave from Yatala Labour Prison for murder 6 years after committing the murder.
Yeah, correct.
But because we're in the grounds of mental health and we're about wellness, and because that limiting term is still in place for life, because she's still going to come home and be drug tested, be alcohol tested, have to take her medication, be looked after at night, within 6 years, we're back walking around the community, getting our hair cut, doing our shopping, buying flowers, whatever it is we feel like doing. Trying to reconcile that as the family of a victim is a massive ask.
Yeah.
It offends the sense of justice. that we all have, because regardless of mental illness, we want somebody to be held accountable, not necessarily pay for what they've done, but we want accountability.
Sure.
Accountability and safety. Well, we're being told that we're still safe. Where's that feeling of accountability? I'm sorry, you want me to make the artificial disconnection in my head of mental illness means I shouldn't feel that way? You can ask the law to do that.
Yeah.
You can't ask humans to do that.
You can't, and yet that's exactly what you and I are trying to do ourselves. And we are asking our listeners, and this is where I talk about, I'm having to reach real deep into my colour palette right now, Sean, and try and let go of how I'm thinking, how I'm feeling about that. And it does come back all the way back to the essence of what we always talk about. To the nth of the legal description here, this is true and correct. To the just piece, this is where I'm struggling to find colours to paint this picture right now. Sean, I said I'm reaching deep right now to try and find the colours to paint this picture. And at the moment, I'm going to be honest, I'm struggling a bit, as we said. I'm trying to fathom this and logically work my way through this. We're 6 years in, as you said. We've now got this data release. Talk to me about where do we end up with this situation of Vicky Wagner and her sister, Michelle Chamberlain?
Let me take you to May 16th, 2018.
Okay.
Time jump of 2 years.
Yep.
I think the best way to do this is let me just read you what I wrote on that day.
Okay.
This is the article I published. A mentally ill, drug-using woman who killed her mother has asked a court to let her live with her partner, who also has a mental illness and used drugs with her before the incident. On Wednesday, exactly 8 years and 1 day after Joyce Brown's death, Vicky Lee Wagner sought a dramatic reduction in her mental health supervision conditions. She asked the Supreme Court to impose a new regime that will see her, within 6 months, living full-time with her partner at Salisbury Downs.
Okay. Let's just put a caveat in here. I need to interject. Now, I was almost going to before, and I didn't. I'll let you go for another paragraph. Sorry, hang on. Now we're talking about the concept that Vicky was using drugs, had a mental condition we know, is now wanting to be released to go and live with her partner, who also has mental conditions, and was also using drugs with Vicky before the incident.
That's right. But it's okay, her lawyer says, because the man, who, like Wagner, has schizophrenia, had quote-unquote self-reported that he had abstained from using cannabis ever since Joyce Brown's death.
That doesn't offer me, and I wouldn't believe our listeners, any further level of comfort so far.
And it offered none to Michelle Chamberlain. She said to me, Tuesday was the 8-year anniversary of the day my mother was brutalised and killed. Now it looks like we're going back to the exact same scenario we had when Vicky killed my mother. I am so concerned. I just keep thinking, is it going to be deja vu?
I'm okay. I was struggling with my colour palette earlier. I'm really trying to comprehend that. That seems incredibly. Sean, help put some clarity for myself and maybe for our listeners to understand, how is this still sitting within the concepts of 269 and an incident and someone being involved in that yet not legally being responsible for that? I need to understand, and how do we now get to a point where we're contemplating 8 years on, as Michelle said, her still being in a situation where she feels no security here in regard to her sister being released back into public sort of domain?
Because unfortunately, the system at this point, the rolling step-down process that was initiated all the way back when no one was listening to Michelle, doesn't actually care that much about Michelle.
Okay.
It's a facet. Absolutely. Her concerns are part of it.
Yeah.
But it's a small piece compared to the overwhelming tidal wave of forensic psychological evidence that's coming down the pipe.
Okay.
Vicky Wagner, by this point, is medicated. She's got victim empathy. She's done courses.
Okay.
She's been going out into the community day after day and living normally. She's been returning at night with no incident. Everything is going fine. She is a model patient, I guess is the word.
To that point, and I do want to, I need to play both sides of this, as we always do, right? And everything you just laid out there, medicated, has done courses, empathy, understanding and training, has had the opportunity to go out and on unsupervised situations and come back without incident, has passed all the tests she needs to. I need to give her that credit to say, you are absolutely right. A model patient, a model rehabilitated person in this circumstance.
And keeping away from her family. Remember, that was one of the conditions.
Absolutely. And following every letter of every law that was prescribed to her that she needed to do. So to that point, I have to give credit to that being upheld, right? And I get that. And I think if you had led with that and there wasn't the indication that we want to go back to a partner with a similar mental case and knowing there's drug use, that feels uncomfortable. So I want to give credit to the fact that it has done all the right things.
Well, let me challenge your empathy on that last point for a moment.
Yeah.
We talk a lot about, let's switch to the criminal track for a minute,
Sure.
the purely criminal track.
Yeah.
We talk a lot about recidivistic offending.
Yes.
People who offend, go to prison, come out of prison, go back to the circumstances into which they came from. That's a function of privilege or lack thereof. It's a function of poverty. It's a function of socioeconomic demographics, all sorts of things.
Lack of support systems and stuff that goes
lack
around that.
Lack of resourcing.
Correct.
All sorts of things. We understand this.
Yes.
Where else is Vicky going to go live?
Yeah, absolutely.
Literally. She
no.
can't go near her family.
Correct.
She was moving into a house at the time that Joyce was killed.
Mm.
Where is she going to go but to her partner?
Yeah.
The fact that her partner, and this was the argument the defense counsel made, the fact that her partner has a mental illness does not mean that he's an unsuitable person to help look after her.
Absolutely. And again, that is my either conscious / possibly unconscious bias of me immediately thinking, well, you can't go into a circumstance that's similar to your circumstance because 1 and 1 equals 2.
That's right.
Right?
And that's what we do. We naturally do that, but these are the things that courts have to stop themselves from doing. Using that kind of bias, thinking that way. Justice Martin Hinton, as he was at the time, now the DPP, he said, look, I understand that this is what you want. I'm not prepared to do it without knowing more about your partner, including his medical reports and any of his criminal history. He said, everyone accepts you have done a remarkable job with your rehabilitation, and you are to be commended for that. But you will appreciate people are still a bit frightened and want some comfort, and this court wants to be cautious.
And look, I think right there, just in that short paragraph you've read, that kind of encapsulates everything that I just kind of said for the last few minutes. You know, I totally get that and say that there is still a level of hesitation in myself in that sense. So, look, I think that's a very responsible paragraph.
And look, I will say this much. Michelle said to me afterwards, in just 6 months, she could be released back into society. That's so concerning to me. This is about what's right. It's not about hate. I haven't got room for hate. Remember again, we love our sister. Don't let her out.
Yeah, absolutely.
This was about fear for safety. This was about what should have been done, what was right, what was just.
Yeah.
We are 8 years removed from one of the most vicious killings that equals one of the worst murders in South Australian history in terms of injuries inflicted.
Yep.
8 years on, we're talking about going home to your partner. That's a really bitter pill to swallow for the individuals involved and for the community at the greater level.
Yeah.
Look, it happened. Vicky did leave the facility. She did go home. I'm pleased to say that I have not seen her name appear in the case lists ever since.
Okay.
I have not seen her partner's name appear in the case lists ever since.
Sure.
It's my hope that wherever she is now, whatever she's doing, she is better. Nonetheless, for Michelle Chamberlain, she was steamrolled.
Yeah, okay.
This entire system that was geared and designed to rehabilitate her sister left her feeling steamrolled.
Okay.
With all the empathy that Justice Kelly showed, with all the empathy Justice Hinton showed, with all the care that Justice Peake showed, it didn't stop the system rolling over that victim voice.
Yeah, okay. It's an interesting point you make there, Sean, because, look, I know I'm not exactly sure where I sit from the concept of a just versus lawful. Clearly, we followed the letter of the law, and clearly we've got all the right diagnosis and all the right treatments and all of that in place. Yet there's still an element here that just feels a little uncomfortable to myself, let alone from Michelle's perspective.
I think one of the things to go back to again is what Judge Kimber said about limiting terms. We're talking about rehabilitation and we're talking about protecting the community. If you woke up at 4 a.m. with your sister standing over you, looking at you, not knowing what was going on, feeling very upset and uncomfortable about that. Your sister then went on to kill your mother. You would be left in fear for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
The question I had throughout the Vicky Wagner case is, when does somebody sit down and talk to Michelle Chamberlain about those fears?
Yeah.
We have all sorts of threat and risk assessments being done by psychologists who are sitting and talking to Vicky Wagner.
Yeah.
Where's the person sitting down and talking to Michelle Chamberlain? Where's the person sitting down and saying, okay, why do you feel this way? Tell me about the incidents. Why are we not having an objective elements trial on the amount of threat that she may or may not pose? Because it may very well be that if we did that, the ultimate conclusion would be the same, that she can still go home to her partner because she doesn't pose a threat.
Yeah.
But perhaps Michelle Chamberlain would feel like somebody other than some journalist had listened to her throughout this process.
Yeah, it's fascinating, Sean. That is one case, and that is simply the first case we take a bit more of an in-depth look at in this concept of mental health coming up and butting up against and intersecting with the legal system, as we talked about.
Where I want to take you next, though, is a completely different facet of that, because to this point, we've talked about interfamilial dynamics, where someone you know, someone you love, has a problem, and there are consequences as a result. Next episode, I want to talk to you about what many people consider the ultimate nightmare scenario. Someone you don't know, a complete stranger, causes absolute devastation in your life, destroys your family, and I don't mean that lightly when I say destroys your family, and then you find out that they're mentally ill and will never see the inside of a prison cell.
Until we get there, though, we just want to take a moment just to give you a couple of numbers. And in no way do we think this is the be-all and end-all. However, if for any reason yourself or someone you know you feel has a situation going on from a mental health perspective, first one is from the South Australian Government. It's the Mental Health Triage Service, available on 131465.
That operates 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
Absolutely. And they can offer you and provide advice and information on mental health emergency and crisis situations. The other one that I want to mention is one called the Acute Crisis Intervention Support Line, and they're available on 131466. If you feel you have someone in your life that is in a situation where they need to, they're in a precarious, sensitive situation, you can contact these people and they will make a call on your behalf to them, and they will look at the situation and try to work them through that service as well.
We have said numerous times on this show, reaching out is not weak. We've urged people to reach out for help with their own mental health. This is just as, if not more important. If someone is incapable of seeking the help that they need for themselves, please help them. Do the right thing by them and by yourself.
Absolutely. In terms of that, we are going to wrap this episode up now. As Sean said, the next few cases we talk about are truly some scary, horrific stuff. And again, it's all underlying with that mental health aspect coming up against the legal system. Until we get there, we do, of course, want to thank everyone who has listened to ourselves either on the broadcast with 5AA or whether you've done that via the iTunes or Spotify podcast. Please, if you have the opportunity, go to one of those platforms, rate, review, leave us a 5-star rating would be wonderful. Obviously, that's how you get us out to the rest of the people out there who may take real benefit from hearing our voices and our message. Of course, if you want to get in contact with us, you can do that on the socials via @JustLawfulPodcast on Facebook and Instagram, @JustLawfulPodcast on Twitter. You can also, of course, follow Sean and all of his work and Adelaide's True Crime with the advertiser @Sean Fuster on Facebook and Twitter. Until we speak to you next time, we just want to remind you, enjoy our work, but don't become our work. And we'll speak to you on the next episode of Just Lawful.